How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I am an avid herpetologist coming to you with a little bit of a mix-up this week. Rather than doing a Digimon deck profile, I'm going to be doing a quick deck profile for my all-time favorite Yu-Gi-Oh deck that I have ever had the joy of playing with. Now, I recognize that Yu-Gi-Oh's had a bit of a reputation in the last couple of years. The game has definitely been power crept into next week. It does not in any way resemble the game that it once was. However, it is still a very fun game for a lot of the players who still continue to play it to this day, myself included. I haven't made a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh content just because the cards are a little bit more wordy than Digimon. I also have just not really had as much time to actually keep up with and play the game, but I do still play the game quite a bit online, and this is a deck that I've been wanting to do a deck profile on for a really long time. As I mentioned, this is my favorite deck that I have ever had the joy of playing in the Yu-Gi-Oh trading card game. This is going to be Paleozoics. Now, Paleozoics are, I think most people would consider past their prime. They were a little bit of a meta showing a couple years back when they first were released. However, even at their absolute pinnacle of meta showing, they were really never run pure. Typically, when you saw a Paleozoic deck, it was going to be Paleozoic frogs. That is kind of how the deck created its notoriety. It was a really cool deck. Basically, the idea is that it's a trap-themed control deck built around level 2 water monsters, aqua types specifically, so you could spam, most often this deck competitively would spam the card Toadally Awesome or Tree Toad if you're like me, and cling onto that OCG name. With that being said, I've actually never run this deck as frogs. I prefer a pure Paleozoic control build. This deck is unbelievably fun to play, and it is constantly growing and adapting as every time a new set gets released and new normal traps get released that are able to counter the meta in different ways, you can continue to grow and evolve the deck to adapt and again kind of be able to properly control different aspects of the meta that maybe it wasn't able to before. So this deck is constantly being upgraded with new traps as they enter the format, so it's not going to look quite the same as it did when I first began playing this deck way back in the day. But I do still, to this very day, play this deck. This is still my primary deck that I use anytime I go to Yu-Gi-Oh events. And yes, as recently as last summer, I did actually win a locals event with this deck. I've won a fair number of locals with this deck, actually, or rather different variations of it. Paleozoics are incredibly resilient. They're incredibly diverse and versatile, and they're just super flavorful. Before I do actually get into the deck profile, I do want to have a little bit of time just to nerd out with you guys about just how flavorful this archetype is. So the Paleozoic archetype, I have been playing these guys since they were originally released in the OCG overseas under the name Burgistomas. Now, Burgistomas is a name that originally was derived from the Burgess Shale Formations, which is a shale formation. It's a fossil dig site, actually. You can find up in, I believe it is Canada. Now, the Burgess Shale Formations are famous because of the surplus of Paleozoic era fossils that can be found in that particular dig site. So the Paleozoic archetype originally was called Burgistomas, which was a really flavorful name, and typically speaking, when archetypes get moved from OCG over to the TCG, they very frequently get name changes. Now, sometimes these name changes are cool, and they end up sounding even better than they did in the OCG. Other times, not so much. The names end up being very messy, almost comical with how bad some of the translations have been. Tree Toad being a perfect example, going from Tree Toad to Toadally Awesome, which I'm sorry, to this day I really can't stand as a name. With that being said, Burgistomas, when they first came over to the TCG, they got the name archetypal change to Paleozoics. Now, Paleozoic, as I mentioned, that is the name of the era that a lot of the arthropod fossils that the archetype is based around were actually originally from, which is, again, super flavorful. I love, they didn't even bother going for like an anime spin on it. They just straight up called this archetype Paleozoics, which I am super in love with. I think that is just so awesome. So not only are the names super flavorful, the archetype name of Paleozoic, but the actual names of every single individual card in this archetype is a real world arthropod. Now, if you don't know what that means, I would highly recommend looking it up. These are some very, very old organisms that still exist today. Some examples of modern arthropods, of course, being insects, arachnids, crustaceans, different organisms with things like exoskeletons. There's lots of things that go into it, but all of these different organisms that build this archetype are real to the world. They did not alter the names at all. So, for instance, the five instances of Paleozoics that you can see on the table here, all five of these, the names that they have are the names of real world animals that did exist at one time, which is, again, super cool. They didn't bother changing them at all. They just straight up call them Paleozoic Marrella, Paleozoic Pikaia, Paleozoic Dinomischus, Paleozoic Olenoides, and Paleozoic Canadia. Every single one of those is a real world animal. I love that. I just think it is the coolest thing that they didn't change it at all. They just let nerds like me have their fun fossil-oriented archetype, and I absolutely love it. Now, all of these do ultimately, even though they are traps, the whole gimmick of the deck is they can summon themselves as monsters. Now, they do not summon themselves as spell or trap monsters, which does help to avoid some nasty synergies where they cannot be blown up by spell and trap removal. But they summon themselves as water monsters. This is a water-themed deck, which I am a big fan of. I'm a huge water advocate. I play a wide variety of different water archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh! I love playing blue in Magic the Gathering, and for my Digimon fans out there, come EX3, I will be playing a water-themed deck with Yugioh, which is going to be the first dedicated water deck in Digimon, so super excited for that. But Yu-Gi-Oh! Is definitely where I first began with my love of water archetypes, and this has been the one that has just lived with me all of these years. I adore the Paleozoic archetype. Now, to begin, we're going to go over what each one of these does. So the Paleozoic cards, each one is going to have its unique trap effect that will activate when you use it on the field, and they all share an identical effect that is unique to Paleozoic cards. So we're going to go through each one of these. So the effect that each one of these shares is, while these cards are in your graveyard, anytime a trap is activated, it doesn't have to be a normal, anytime a continuous, a normal trap, whatever, whenever a trap gets activated on either side of the field, you may choose to chain one of these from your graveyard in an attempt to summon itself. So when a trap is activated, you can attempt to summon one of these from your graveyard. All of them can do it. When they do summon themselves, they come in as a 1200 attack, 0 defense, level 2, aqua type, normal monster, water attribute, with the added bonus added from the card itself, because they are normal monsters, but they come with the added bonus that they are unaffected by monster effects. Now, no matter what Paleozoics you're dealing with, whether it be the trap monsters or your extra deck monsters, they all share this effect where they are immune to monster effects. They are unaffected by all monster effects, both the opponent and your own, which is super helpful and super relevant, and we're going to talk a little bit about why as we get onward through the deck. So each one of them has the ability to summon themselves as a nifty little level 2 monster onto the field. They are not still considered trap cards at that point. So each one of these also has a trap effect. To begin with, we're going to talk about our primary two up here. These are Marrella and Pikaia. Now, these are going to be important because they are our startup cards. When we're talking about this deck, as I mentioned, the way that these cards want to work is they summon themselves from the graveyard. So you need to actually get some into your graveyard so you can actually benefit from starting to make responses with your actual interactive traps. So we want to have startup cards, and these are going to be the best too. Marrella here is actually a Foolish Burial Goods. It is going to activate and send any trap you want from your deck to the graveyard. If this is turn 1 and I am activating Marrella, usually during my opponent's standby phase, so I can be ready to go once we hit their main phase, Marrella is typically just going to send another copy of itself from my deck to the graveyard, so we can start my opponent's turn with 2 Paleozoics in the graveyard. Pikaia is a trade-in for Paleozoic cards. So as you can see, we are running 15 in the main board. I have run 16 in the past, and sometimes I do go up and down again, depending on how the meta currently looks. But Pikaia lets you discard any Paleozoic trap from your hand to the graveyard in order to draw 2 cards. So these are going to be the 2 primary startup cards that let us get some Paleozoics into our graveyard so that we can immediately start rotating as soon as our opponent starts making their plays. Now, the 3 that we have on the bottom here, these are our interactive Paleozoic cards. You're probably pretty familiar with Paleozoic Dinomischus. Even though the Paleozoic archetype does not really see a lot of play anymore, Paleozoic Dinomischus does still see some spotty play every once in a while because it is a very powerful card in its own right. Paleozoic Dinomischus has the effect, when it's activated, you can target any face-up card. On resolution, you would then discard any card from your hand in order to banish that face-up card. So basically, you activate this. You do not discard as part of a cost. It is discarding at resolution. So you just activate this, target something, any face-up card, be it a trap or a spell, a monster, doesn't matter. If the effect goes through, then you discard a card, banish that card, and it goes to the graveyard, where it can then, of course, be brought back. Next, we have Paleozoic Olenoides. This is a dust tornado. So Paleozoic Olenoides just has a simple effect to destroy any target spell or trap card. Still super relevant. There are still Mystic Mind decks in the format for some reason. This deck is actually pretty great against the Mystic Mind archetype, just because we do have not only 6 Paleozoic cards that can get rid of spell and traps, but we are running other back row removal as well. This is, again, a very powerful control archetype. The nice thing about this archetype is even if you do have a certain matchup where you're not really worried about spell and trap removal, or whatever the case may be, you do have plenty of discard effects where you can pitch the ones that aren't necessary for your strategy in that particular game and make maximum use of the cards that are. Now, our last Paleozoic is actually my favorite in the entire deck. This is Paleozoic Canadia, and this is a Book of Moon effect, believe it or not. So this has the effect to target a face-up monster your opponent controls and flip it from face up into face down defense position. This is extremely powerful, even by today's standards. Book of Moon, again, is kind of out of its depth. Doesn't see a whole lot of play, but honestly, I don't understand why. Setting monsters is actually one of the most powerful things you can be doing in the game right now. Now, it's not going to stop every deck cold in its tracks, but there's not a lot that most decks can do with a face-down monster. Now, there's still going to be decks that, for instance, fusion summon that can still make use of a face-down monster. It's not completely useless, but setting a monster face down, especially in a format of the game where your normal summon is so vitally important for so many decks, setting a monster can sometimes just stop their entire turn cold. But if you can place a good Paleozoic Canadia at the right moment, you can absolutely vitally cripple your opponent's first turn, or whatever the case may be. It is a very, very powerful card. So this is just the opening to our little control suit here. You can already see the general idea of the deck. Using lots of powerful trap effects to generate advantage, we want to dump our Paleozoics into the graveyard so we can start bringing them back as soon as possible. So the first additional trap we are going to be running is probably one of the most important in the entire deck, and that is 3 copies of Trap Trick. Now, of course, this is a trap-heavy deck, and I do mean 37 out of 40 cards in this deck are trap cards, which means we are going to be playing a very diverse toolbox of interactive traps. So Trap Trick basically lets us get whatever trap we need in that particular moment. Now, not only is Trap Trick great for getting the correct interaction when we need it, but it's also the only card in the deck that is going to give us 2 activations which can bring back 2 Paleozoics with a single card. This is one of the greatest ways that this deck is able to not only develop board presence very early, very quickly, but it's also a great way to make comebacks if you ever do find yourself in a position where you're starting to fall behind in tempo, which, believe it or not, does not happen very often. This deck tempos extraordinarily well thanks to one of our extra deck boss monsters. Now, on top of Trap Trick, we are also going to be running 2 additional startup cards to go with Marrella and Pikaia. We are running 2 copies of Needlebug Nest. Needlebug Nest just says mill 5 cards when it's activated. It's a very, very easy card to kind of flip over. Again, if I'm going to be starting a game, ideally in my opening hand, I want to see at least 1 copy of Pikaia, Marrella, or Needlebug Nest. So as soon as my opponent starts their turn, I can flip it over and again have a graveyard that is loaded and ready to go so I can start bringing things back as soon as possible. Now we need to start talking about protection, because these are, as I mentioned, they're going to be coming back only as 1200 power, 0 defense, normal monsters. They are not super resilient while they're on the field. So we need to make sure we have ways to keep them protected long enough to get back to our turn, because our boss monsters are absolutely able to defend themselves. So the first thing that we're going to be running at 3 copies is Threatening Roar. You don't see this card too often, but it used to be a very big staple in Yu-Gi-Oh! It has a very simple one-line effect, which again, you don't see in Yu-Gi-Oh! Super often anymore. Just says your opponent cannot declare an attack for this turn. So basically, just by activating Threatening Roar, not only can we bring a Paleozoic back on the activation, making sure that we have at least one body, but it also helps to almost guarantee that that Paleozoic and the rest of our field makes it back to our turn. Since all of our Paleozoics are immune to monster effects, making them also unable to be attacked means your opponent is extremely limited in the ways that they can actually deal with your board state. Now, there are certain decks that are, of course, going to have forms of removal in traps and spells. Using things like Kaiju to tribute them is still a completely valid strategy, but for the most part, generally speaking, this is going to be excellent at making sure your board will at least survive back until your turn, so you can reestablish a board state and start making some scary boss monster plays. So Threatening Roar is incredibly valuable. The other big thing to mention with Threatening Roar, one of the big, of course, weaknesses of an almost entirely trap-based deck is things such as Harpy's Feather Duster and Lightning Storm. You want to make sure your back row does not get completely wiped out. If your back row does get completely wiped out, and they happen to chain or drop a Lightning Storm on you the first turn that you have a full set board, Threatening Roar is one of the best ways to not instantly pick up your cards. Again, it's pretty certain, not guaranteed, but it's pretty certain that your board is going to make it back to your turn once you've activated the Roar. Not every time, but it's pretty reliable. So if they go to Lightning Storm you, and you have things in your yard already, you can activate Threatening Roar in response, bring something back. If you're in a position where you have other spells or traps that can be activated, you can, of course, then chain them as well, just to bring some bodies back to the board and have something to do once the turn gets back to you. You don't have to lose everything to just that Lightning Storm. So Threatening Roar is vitally important for that reason. Next up is going to be our other 3 copies of Battle Protection in the form of 3 copies of Storming Mirror Force. Now, a lot of people are probably familiar with Mirror Force itself. Storming Mirror Force is pretty much the same thing, but when your opponent attacks, rather than destroying your opponent's face-up monsters, you're returning them to the hand. Nowadays, this is, of course, much stronger than the regular Mirror Force, since you are not going to be triggering the plethora of on-deletion effects that are out there, or excuse me, on-destruction effects. Been playing Digimon too much. It's also a great way for getting rid of various monsters that are going to have lots and lots of different immunities. Being immune to destruction effects is very common nowadays, but there really aren't too many things that are immune to getting returned to the hand. Of course, those things still exist, but this is by far one of the best catch-outs and board clears that is going to exist in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, generally speaking, battle phase traps like Mirror Forces are kind of frowned upon just because they're a bit slow. My argument is, first of all, since you are going to be playing 5 back row most turns, they're not going to really be able to just spot remove it, you know, with Nightmare Phoenix or anything like that. The Galaxy Cyclone, they're going to have to get very lucky. You start to see where I'm going with this. So unless they have a mass back row remove or somehow manage to get multiple negates that are able to stop traps. Now, obviously, Omni negates exist, but we're hoping that at the very least we'll be able to set up enough of a board either before those negates come down that are protected, or just have other interrupts that we can use to bait the Omni negates so this can resolve successfully. Once this resolves, generally speaking, that turn is pretty much over. Bouncing your opponent's entire board is usually enough to just end their turn outright. It is incredibly powerful, one of the best responses to make in the deck, so absolutely running it at 3 copies. Opponents generally don't seem to expect it just because battle phase traps are not super common right now. So just on the fact that they are generally considered poor, you can use that to your advantage and hopefully catch your opponent off guard. Next up is going to be all of our utility traps. A lot of these we are only running 2 copies of. I believe the rest of these actually we're only running 2 copies each of. So we want to have 1 copy available to send off to Trap Trick if we want to fetch for it, while also being able, of course, to see it in our opening hand when we can. Multiple copies is always a good thing. The first tech card we're going to be running is Ice Dragon's Prison. This is still an incredibly versatile card and is still an incredibly powerful card, especially right now in a format that is dominated by tier elements, by sprites. There's lots of different decks that are really, really strong that Ice Dragon's Prison is still phenomenal against. Bringing back an opponent's monster from their graveyard and then exiling something else is enough, again, to hard stop certain decks. Each one of these cards can be backbreaking against certain archetypes, and even against archetypes that they're not phenomenal against, you can still absolutely use these in very beneficial ways. Now, Ice Dragon's Prison has some extra nice synergies to mention. Even if you choose not to go for the banish play, if you just happen to have maybe a level 2 monster in your opponent's graveyard, and you happen to activate this card, even if they don't have something to banish, you can bring back their level 2, summon yourself a Paleozoic from your graveyard, and now you have 2 level 2s that you can start making extra deck plays with. So even if you don't want to use this as removal, if your opponent happens to have some level 2s, this can be very good in that way as well. Now, the next card I want to talk about, because I'm not actually sure how many people are aware this card actually exists, it's a pretty random common from the most recent set, and it's called Terror of the Overroot. So Terrors of the Overroot is a normal trap card. I'm going to go ahead and read off this effect, because again, I don't know that this one is quite as common as some of the other ones. Target one card your opponent controls, any card, and one card in their graveyard. Send the card on the field to the graveyard, and if you do, set the other card from the graveyard to your opponent's field. You can only activate one Terrors of the Overroot per turn. So basically what this is saying is you can target any card on your opponent's field, any card in their graveyard, and you're going to swap them. But the card that you're bringing back from the graveyard is going to get set to their field. So let's say they have a very problematic creature and you don't want to trigger their on destroy effects. Let's say that they have pesky back row or a frustrating spell or trap in play that you're trying to get rid of. This can hit any card you want, send it to the graveyard instead of destroying, and then what you're able to do is set something. Now, in a format that is so heavily dominated by hand traps, there's probably going to be an Effect Veiler, Ash Blossom, DD Crow. All of these are cards that are likely to be in the graveyard. So you can just set one of those to your opponent's field, and again, they're probably not going to be able to do anything with it that turn. So the way you think about it, you are basically just removing whatever card you want and then giving them nothing. You're basically taking up a board space because they're probably not going to be able to do anything with that set card, especially with some of those weaker cards. They're really not going to do anything with it, even if they happen to get back to their turn. Yeah, it is just a phenomenal card. I've been trying this card out. I've honestly considered putting it up to 3. I think it is bonkers. And it's a really great example of, like I said, every time new sets come out and we get these random normal trap cards, even commons, that a lot of people may dismiss as bulk, there can absolutely be gems that make decks like this shine. So Terrors of the Overroot is one of my newest additions to this deck and has been performing very, very well. Next up is going to be 2 copies of Dimensional Barrier. Again, people are probably pretty familiar with this card. It's a normal trap that on activation, you choose Xyz, Fusion, Synchro, or Ritual, or Pendulum. And for the rest of the turn, your opponent cannot special summon monsters of that type, and you negate the effects of all monsters of that type while they're on the field. Always probably going to be a relevant card, as every single one of those at various times has had big showings in the meta. Even if it's not, again, you can easily just move this card to the sideboard for more interactive cards if you really want to. I'm personally still running it in the main board because, again, tier elements are running all over the place right now. There's plenty of synchro decks, plenty of fusion decks. Branded is still pretty well represented in the meta. So I'm absolutely still going to be running Dimensional Barrier. It is still phenomenal for helping shut down opponents. Next, we're going to play 2 copies of Heavy Storm Duster. This is a Twin Twisters that you do not have to discard for. You target any 2 spell or trap cards on the field, up to any 2 spell or trap cards on the field, and destroy them, with the only downside being that if it's your turn, you cannot conduct your battle phase this turn. So this is a very easy, no-brainer on your opponent's turn. Activate it, blow up any 2 spell or trap cards. You have synergies with your Paleozoics to bring them back, while also getting a 2-for-1. It's a great way, again, to push your tempo forward. Now, the next card is not one you're going to find yourself activating super often. This is another common called Boo Boo Game. Now, Boo Boo Game is another card you've probably not heard of before. It actually does have an in-play effect, but the primary reason we want to use this card is for its on-destruction effect. This is basically a different version of this card, Waking the Dragon. Waking the Dragon is a very common back row trap that when it's destroyed, you can summon any monster you want from your extra deck. So it's very, very powerful. Let you bring out incredibly powerful cards such as Last Warrior from Another Planet, Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, Raid Raptor Ultimate Falcon. All of these cards are very, very powerful, and you can just drop them for free, with the downside being that your opponent has to destroy that back row card in order for it to do literally anything. It doesn't have an in-play effect. They have to destroy it or it does nothing. So that is a big downside. The upside, of course, being that you get major upside. Basically, the idea is that if you're playing a back row heavy deck, you want to pack cards like these because if your opponent does Lightning Storm you, again, you're not left with nothing. You punish your opponent for trying to remove your back row. Boo Boo Game is similar, but in this particular shell, I have found that I think the effect that this has is actually a little more reliable than Waking the Dragon. As I mentioned, it does actually have an in-play effect. Whenever your opponent attacks during damage calculation, you can activate this to make sure that you take no damage from that battle. So in an absolute emergency pinch, let's say your opponent is going, for instance, a Numeron Dragon OTK. They swing in, you flip this. Well, now all of that was for nothing. You take 0 damage. And since in the case of Numeron Dragon, they have to pass because they can't attack or summon anything else. But it's just like a little extra effect in there, but the primary reason you play it, when this is destroyed and sent to your graveyard by your opponent's card effect, you can choose any 2 normal traps you want in your graveyard, set them to your field, and then they can also be activated that turn. So again, if your opponent decides to go for a Lightning Storm, let's say perfect scenario, or even a half-decent scenario, they go to Lightning Storm. You chain Threatening Roar, you chain Dimensional Barrier, name Fusion. You bring 2 Paleozoics back to the field, your opponent cannot attack for the rest of the turn. They wipe the board, destroy Boo Boo Game. Now you can take any 2 of those traps that just got sent to your graveyard and bring them right back to your field again, and you can still use them for interaction that turn. So this, I think, is an incredible gotcha card. It, again, has proven itself very, very strong in this shell. I really like it. That is my personal back row protection card of choice. It is worth mentioning, again, just like Waking the Dragon, since you are running 2, if your opponent goes to destroy your back row, you can activate a trap trick, exile 1, set the other. Now you not only get your 2 traps back, but you can bring back whatever you want. So it is absolutely phenomenal. The next trap, and actually the last trap number 37 we are running, is a trap called Redeemable Jar. Now, this is another card that I'm not sure everyone has probably heard of before, so we're going to go over the effects. This is the only continuous trap in the entire deck. It is very, very strong, and I think 1 is probably right. I have experimented with running 2 in place of one of my only 3 monsters, but I think 1 is probably right, but you can also experiment with 2 if you decide to give this deck a try for yourself. So it has an effect where on either turn you can banish 1 trap from your graveyard, add from your graveyard to your hand 1 trap with a different original name from that banished card. You can only use this effect of Redeemable Jar once per turn. So basically, as long as you want to, especially later in the game, if you have a loaded graveyard, once during both turns, you can exile a trap and get a trap back. This is going to help you lock your opponent out of the game in many cases. Great example being Branded. Branded are a deck that need to fusion summon to do anything. If you find yourself in a position where you have Redeemable Jar in play and there is a dimensional barrier in your graveyard and you have enough fodder to keep exiling to bring that barrier back, you can shut that Branded player out of the game completely. Redeemable Jar is a back-breaking tempo engine. Being able to get 2 traps back every turn cycle is huge. And the fact that you get to choose from any of your interactions, you can always choose the interaction that is most powerful against whatever deck you're playing against, is amazing. It is an absolutely, again, back-breaking card. So cannot raise the praises of Redeemable Jar enough. Now, it's also worth mentioning, you want to talk about heavy synergies. Activating a Needlebug Nest and also immediately flipping over Redeemable Jar, after your Needlebug Nest resolves, you are going to minimum have 6 traps, probably. You could have less because if you hit monster cards, but more than likely you are already going to have 6 different traps in your graveyard that you can already start bringing back with Redeemable Jar. So you will already start boom, 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 just accruing this in crazy level of value. Out-tempoing your opponent is one of the most difficult things for a lot of control decks to do, and Paleozoics have a lot of really interesting ways of doing it. Redeemable Jar is another fairly new card that I don't think has gotten a lot of spotlight, but I'm telling you, see it in action. This card is incredible. Now, the last 3 cards in the deck, as I mentioned, we are only running 3 monsters in this entire deck, mostly because we don't want to be completely caught with our pants down, but having additional bodies that we can summon to back up our Paleozoics. If we need to make extra deck plays and we were only to get 1 or 2 Paleozoics, you know, we weren't quite able to get our last body, being able to bring extra bodies out without spending trap resources is very important. So the 3 monsters that I am currently running in my my monster slot is 3 copies of Ret-Time Reviver Emit-Ter. Another very obscure, very rogue card with a very cool effect. So, Ret-Time Reviver Emit-Ter is a level 2 Dark Fairy Tuner effect monster. It has 800 attack points and 0 defense points. It has an effect where if this card is in your hand or graveyard, you may target one face-up monster on each field, change them to face-down defense position, and if you do, special summon this card, but banish it when it leaves the field. You, of course, may only use this effect of Ret-Time Reviver Emit-Ter once per turn. So we're going to go over the synergies for this card because when I discovered this card, it was a no-brainer to include in this deck. So if you have this in your hand, of course, you can normal summon it, you can overlay with it, and then if you detach it for cost, you also have the ability to bring it back from your graveyard. So again, it's 2 bodies for the price of 1. It is roll compression, which again is helping with your tempo plays, making multiple uses from a single card. The fact that it's a tuner means we can make some cool synchro plays if we decide to go that route. I am running a synchro monster in my extra deck, but Ret-Time Reviver Emit-Ter has an effect that also Book of Moons, again, one of your opponent's monsters, which is very, very powerful. It's a very good effect that's going to help remove specific, any kind of certain situational negates and things like that. It can help bait out quick effects, all that kind of stuff. But the reason it's so powerful in this deck in particular is, again, all of our Paleozoics are immune to monster effects. The only time you would ever flip down one of your own monsters is if you either had a Ret-Time Reviver Emit-Ter already in play, or a different extra deck monster like Toadally Awesome. Those would get set face down, but as long as you have even one Paleozoic on your field, if you want to bring this in for free, you just target your Paleozoic, target one of your opponent's monsters. They'll both attempt to flip down, yours will not, theirs will, then you're left with 2 bodies and they are now down a body entirely. This card is super, super awesome. It is vastly overperformed, and because it does play out of the graveyard, you don't have to worry about milling it off of things like Needlebug Nest. It gets sent to the graveyard, and now you just get picked up an extra body on top of all of the traps and potential Paleozoics that you've dumped there. This is the full main board for this deck. I'm hoping that with all of my descriptions, you guys can see how synergistic so many of the pieces of this deck are. It flows like a well-oiled machine. I told you guys, I've been playing this deck for years. I've taken the time and I have tuned this deck to a really awesome point. Now, again, as new traps begin to come out and get introduced to the game, this deck list will absolutely continue to change and evolve. In fact, we've got a new set, Darkwing Blast, is going to be dropping this coming Friday, and there is a new trap that I am 100% going to be trying out in this deck called Destructive Daruma Karma Cannon. It is a wild name, but the trap is awesome. It is absolutely bonkers. I'm probably honestly going to end up replacing Storming Mirror Force, at least in part. Maybe cutting it down to 2 and something else and bringing in 2 copies of Daruma because it is really, really powerful. So yeah, that's going to do it for my main board. This deck, again, is just so much fun. If you are looking for something that is not meta, something that you want to do to kind of just give the finger, honestly, to a lot of the meta, being able to hard counter so many different plays and play a really powerful control game, this is a really fun deck. I do highly recommend experimenting with Paleozoics yourself. Now we're going to move on and talk a bit about the extra deck. We've got some really spicy stuff in this extra deck to talk about, so we're going to jump right into that as well. To begin with, we do have 2 Paleozoic-specific Xyz monsters in this deck. We have Paleozoic Anomalocaris, one of my favorite Yu-Gi-Oh cards of all time, and we have another 3 copies of Paleozoic Opabinia. Now, as I mentioned, these are both also immune to monster effects. That is the very first part of their effects. They also each get bonus effects depending on if they have trap cards equipped as material, meaning, of course, using your Paleozoic cards as material, and even more bonus effects on top of that. There's a lot to take in with both of these. So we'll start with Paleozoic Anomalocaris. This is kind of the big boss monster for the deck. He is my go-to if I'm looking for big tempo or advantage pushes. He is a rank 2 and requires 3 or more level 2 monsters. So it's generic, but it does have to be level 2, and you can choose to put more than 3, but you can put no less than 3. It has 2,400 attack points, 0 defense points, keeping with the Paleozoic theme of intervals of 1,200 and then 0 of the other stat. It is an Aqua type monster. First line on the card is that immunity to monster effects. Also has the effect once per turn if a trap card is sent from your spell and trap zone to the graveyard except during the damage step. You can excavate the top card of your deck, and if it is a trap card, add it to your hand. Otherwise, send it to the graveyard. you guys may realize this is one of the big reasons that I am playing 37 traps. We want to hit trap cards off of this as often as we possibly can. So basically, once this guy has hit the field, every first trap you activate on both turns is a cantrip, which basically just means it will most likely replace itself. You are sending a trap to the graveyard and probably adding a trap directly from the top of your deck to your hand. Very, very, very powerful effect. Now, again, the downside is if you happen to hit one of your only 3 monsters, of course, it goes to the graveyard, but those benefits of Ret-Time Reviver Emit-Ter is even though it's in the graveyard, you can still bring it back. So nothing but value there. It also has an effect on either turn, once per turn. If this card has a trap card as material, you can detach 1 Xyz material from this card to target any 1 card on the field and destroy it. So it is spell speed 2 removal, usable on both turns. So again, that is going to be the big benefit for controlling the board. It again can target anything, doesn't have to be a monster, doesn't have to be spell or trap. So very diverse, super, super good. The other card that we have is Paleozoic Opabinia. This is an Aqua level rank 2 Xyz monster, requires 2 level 2 monsters. Has the reverse stats of Paleozoic Anomalocaris, so 0 attack and 2400 defense. Again, unaffected by other monsters' effects. You can activate Paleozoic trap cards from your hand. This is the best first card to drop. So if you are working on getting your first setup, you've made it through your opponent's first turn, you've got some Paleozoic bodies on the board, you want to make Opabinia first. So this is going to be the first card you're generally going to go into. So the first benefit it has, as it mentioned, you can activate Paleozoic trap cards directly from your hand, so you don't have to set them. Sometimes there's a benefit to setting them if they happen to have, again, like things like Kaiju or things you may not be expecting. You may want your cards in play in order to make sure that you can still use them even if they do happen to get through Opabinia somehow. But generally speaking, being able to hold up trap cards, especially multiple trap cards that you can drop on a single open spell or trap card zone, is very, very nice. But the other effect is where this card really, really, really shines. On your turn, once per turn, you can detach an Xyz material from this card to add any Paleozoic trap card from your deck to your hand. So you can add any of the 5 that we mentioned earlier, whether that be one of your interactive ones, your Spell and Trap Removal, Book of Moon Effect, Banish a Face Up, or more commonly is if I'm already in a position where I'm either looking for specific answers or I really just want to make sure I keep my tempo and card pool up. If you already have a Paleozoic in your hand, you can either tutor for Pikaia, or if you have Pikaia in hand, you can tutor for any other Paleozoic you don't think you're going to need to instantly bring another Paleozoic back from your graveyard and draw 2 fresh cards. So super good, again, to make sure we are grinding through our deck and seeing lots of cards very quickly. It is a very powerful interaction. Now, this card is especially powerful with that card I mentioned, Redeemable Jar, the one that lets you get any spell or trap, or any normal trap card back from your graveyard to your hand on either turn. If you're following along, since you can activate traps directly from your hand, you can basically at any point choose one of your Paleozoics with a relevant effect that you want, grab it back, and slap it down immediately to stop whatever play your opponent's trying to go for. Very good interactions, lots of synergies. This deck works like a well-oiled machine. I absolutely love it. Now, of course, we are going to be playing our single copy of Toadally Awesome. I'll be honest, I'm trying in my head. I'm trying to remember if Toadally Awesome is currently limited or not. It keeps going up and down on the banned list. I've honestly never wanted more than one of this card anyway. So as long as Toadally Awesome isn't banned, I will be probably just running a single copy. This is a card that I will sometimes go to help close a match. If I'm really close to winning and I want to make sure my opponent can't come back, I'll usually make Toadally Awesome just to help remove any chance that they have a comeback card off the top of their deck. Generally speaking, though, these are the cards I tend to favor out of my extra deck. Toadally Awesome if I need to, but often it's going to be these. Since Toadally Awesome does require an Aqua-type as material, you cannot use Ret-Time Emit-Ter if you want to make Toadally Awesome, just as worth mentioning, but its generic Omni-Negate is, of course, always going to be relevant. It's a very powerful card. Now we're going to get into some even spicier tech choices. Our first tech choice is Sky Cavalry Centaurea. This card is also a little bit past its prime, but used to be a bit of a staple in decks that were able to make rank 2s. It has 2,000 attack points. It requires 2 level 2 monsters. It cannot be destroyed by battle while it has Xyz material. And at the end of the damage step, if this card battled an opponent's monster, you can detach 1 Xyz material from this card to return that monster to the owner's hand. This is basically just trying to get around very pesky cards that are very difficult to remove. Think cards like Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, any number of different cards that have different, immunities to targeting, to destruction. It's going to help you get rid of some of those stickier bodies. Basically just in there for that purpose. Next one is another super spicy card. This is Cat Shark. It's a weird card, but it does have its uses, and its use is pretty easy to explain. So Cat Shark is another rank 2, requires 2 level 2 monsters, 500 attack and defense. While this card has an Xyz material that was originally water, it cannot be destroyed by battle. Doesn't really matter, we don't play any main board effect monsters that are water, so don't worry about that part. The meaningful part is the second. Once per turn during either player's turn, you can attach 1 Xyz material from this card, then target a rank 4 or lower Xyz monster you control. The attack and defense become double its original attack and defense until the end of the turn. Worth mentioning, this does not work on our Paleozoics since they are immune to monster effects. However, it does work to double our Cavalry Centaurea and our Toadally Awesome. It will double them to 4,000 and 4,400 attack points respectively. The reason this matters is because there are, as you guys know, cards that exist in the game like Raid Raptor Ultimate Falcon, Blackwing Full Armor Master, that have the just wonderful design space of being immune to all card effects, period. So basically, if you can't swing over them or kaiju them off, you can't get through them. I don't like getting stuck in situations like that, so having Cat Shark to double these guys up to a nice high value so you can swing over those problematic cards, that is the reason that this card is in here. So it's earning that spot for that reason. Next is going to be a copy of Gigantic Spright. Which probably doesn't surprise anybody. This card is pretty generic. It's very good right now. And the fact that it can bring out our wonderful Ret-Time Emit-Ter, who can then do something else and then, of course, bring itself back with its set effect. It's a very good card. Very, very powerful. It's good for extending plays. And if you do happen to use its ability to overlay on top of a Link monster or something of that nature, it can, be a 3,200 beater, which is not too much, just enough at either. We are, of course, also going alongside it with a Spright Elf, which again brings back our Emit-Ters. Can potentially also bring back Paleozoic Opabinia or Anomalocaris if we're just trying to link climb. That's the primary reason this card is here, is if you want to be link climbing. We also have IP Masquerena. So if you want to do your Gigantic Spright plays and go for a full link for monster, being able to go into IP Masquerena is Masquerena is going to let us actually do that on the opponent's turn. And the rank 4 of choice that we are running is Topologic Bomber Dragon. Now this card is a bully in this deck. If you can set this card up early enough, your opponent's going to have a hard time playing through it. So for those of you unfamiliar with Topologic Bomber Dragon, this is a rank 4 monster, Cyburst, with 3,000 attack points. It requires 2 or more effect monsters. So the reason that's important to mention is it means you cannot make this with your regular trap Paleozoics. You need to turn those Paleozoics into other things before you can actually make this. That actually reminds me, there is a downside to Paleozoics that I did forget to mention, and I sincerely apologize that it took me this long. Paleozoics, while they are normal monsters on the field, if they leave the field by any means, they banish themselves. So if you do not Xyz summon with them and not turn them into Xyz material, they will remove themselves from the field and will not be able to be recycled. So do make sure you keep track of that. But if you do choose to go into Topologic Bomber Dragon, it has some gnarly effects. If another monster is special summoned to a zone a Link monster points to, while this monster is on the field, destroy all monsters in the main monster zones. Also, your other monsters cannot attack for the rest of the turn. What that means is this is, for the most part, a one-sided Raigeki that you can activate at spell speed 2, probably up to 3 times. This has arrows pointing down left, center, and down right, which means that there are going to be 3 opportunities where on your opponent's turn or your own turn, anytime you activate a trap, you can revive a Paleozoic to one of those arrows, wipe the board. Since your Paleozoics are immune to monster effects, they stick around. Your opponent's monster is probably not so lucky. So up to 3 times, as long as you have 3 open arrows, you can bring something back, wipe the board, bring something back, wipe the board, bring something back, wipe the board. And since this is probably in your extra monster zone while this is going on, obviously, he's going to stick around too. It is a one-sided board wipe, and it is, again, a very powerful play that can be tricky to play through. Additionally, has an effect that's kind of like gravy on here. After damage calculation, if this card attacked an opponent's monster, inflict damage to your opponent equal to that monster's original attack. So that is an effect that's basically just a little extra burn damage. It's going to help you close out games pretty quickly. Super, super strong. And it actually segues very well into the last 2 cards in our extra deck, which, as I promised, are synchros for Ret-Time Reviver Emit-Ter. It is actually 2 separate copies of Armory Arm. Yes, I am playing copies of Armory Arm in this deck. So to begin with, Armory Arm is a level 4. It is a machine with 1800 attack, 1200 defense, requires 1 tuner and 1 non-tuner, or 1 plus non-tuner. So basically you're going to use Ret-Time Reviver Emit-Ter and any of your Paleozoics. That's always what you're going to make this with. Once per turn, you can either target a monster on the field and equip this card to that target, or unequip this card and special summon it in attack position. While equipped by this effect, this target gains 1000 attack points. Now it's worth mentioning that if you make Armory Arm and equip it to any of your Paleozoics, they do gain the 1000 attack, because once it's in your spell and trap, it is not a monster anymore, it is a spell card. So it does absolutely count and will boost your Paleozoic Anomalocaris from 24 to 3400. Much more difficult to get over. It also has the exact same effect as Topologic Bomber Dragon, where if it is equipped, and the equipped monster destroys a monster in battle, inflict damage to your opponent equal to its attack power. Goodness forgive you ever are able to equip an Armory Arm to your Topologic Bomber Dragon. They would then take double their monster's attack points plus any other battle damage. So again, a great way to close the game out for a deck that isn't playing a lot of big splashy OTK plays. It's going for control and slow ping, ping, ping damage for usually 1200, sometimes 2400. But yeah, with that, guys, that is going to do it for this deck profile. I haven't made a whole lot of Yu-Gi-Oh content, and honestly, I'm a bit sad about it. I've been greatly enjoying making a lot of Digimon TCG content, but I still very much do enjoy playing both Yu-Gi-Oh and Magic the Gathering, so I'm hoping in the coming weeks to finally start getting some content out there for these other games as well. If you guys did enjoy this deck profile, please feel free to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below if you have any other suggestions for various traps. I've played lots of different traps in this deck over the years, but if you've got one that you don't think I've heard of before, drop it down there. By all means, show me something, some spicy tech that I have not seen before. My extra deck and my side deck is also filled with various responsive traps that are really awesome and have lots of really cool synergies, like Imperial Iron Wall, which keeps your Paleozoics from getting banished and also stops a lot of exile plays that your opponent might have. So again, thank you all so much for joining me again. Once again, I'm an avid herpetologist. I hope you guys have a great rest of your night, and I will see you next time.